Hello everyone and welcome to our module on dissociative disorders. Dissociation is a psychological reaction to severe emotional trauma or distress, and patients describe dissociation as a feeling of being attached from reality. They may say they feel like they are outside their body or like they are floating above the world and not part of the real world. This is what we mean when we say dissociation. And dissociation really occurs along a spectrum. Some patients can briefly dissociate after a severe stressful emotional event. Other patients can have a severe dissociative disorder where they dissociate so much they become another person and forget their old name, their old job, or even how old they are. And we'll talk about this whole spectrum of dissociative disorders in this video. As I said, dissociation is usually associated with some form of psychological trauma, and it's probably a way that it allows the victim and the brain to cope with the trauma that was experienced. The first dissociative disorder we'll talk about is dissociative amnesia. This is also known as psychogenic amnesia. And patients who develop this form of dissociation are unable to recall autobiographical memories. And by this I mean things like past events in their life, what their job was, where they live, sometimes even their name. Just like all dissociative disorders, this usually follows a major psychological trauma or stress. It's potentially reversible because the memories are not lost, the patient just cannot access them, so the memories may come back. And the patient is usually not bothered by the lack of memory, and that's because, as we talked about before, dissociation is a way to cope with a stressful event, so the dissociative amnesia is actually helpful to the patient. And then finally, to meet criteria for dissociative amnesia, the amnesia has to be not explained by another cause, like head trauma or a brain tumor or something along those lines. Don't confuse dissociative amnesia from other forms of amnesia like retrograde or antegrade amnesia after head trauma. In dissociative amnesia, patients forget large groups of memories, things like their name, their job, or where they live. And dissociative amnesia is always caused by overwhelming stress. Other forms of amnesia are usually caused by head injury or something organic, and patients forget events before or after the head trauma, not things like large swaths of autobiographical information. And then also don't confuse dissociative amnesia with repression. Patients who experience a traumatic event can repress memories of the event as a way to cope with what they experienced. But they will only repress memories of the event. They will not lose autobiographical information. When you lose autobiographical information, like you can't remember your name or where you work or where you live, these things indicate dissociative amnesia. So here's an example of dissociative amnesia. A woman is attacked in an elevator. It's a very traumatic event. Afterwards, she does not recall her job or where she lives or other elements of her day-to-day life. This is usually self-limited and the memories will come back because the memories aren't lost. The patient just cannot access them because of the traumatic event, and the treatment is with psychotherapy. A dissociative fugue is a subtype of dissociative amnesia. Fugue is a Latin word for fight or flee, so a person who has a dissociative fugue will forget things about themselves like their name and where they live, and they will begin to travel or wander in a dissociated state. So as an example, imagine a manager is fired from his job and it's a very stressful and traumatic event, and then he goes missing. He's found later in another town. He does not remember his prior job or even where he lived or even his name. This is an example of a man who went on a dissociative fugue. Moving on, let's talk about depersonalization derealization disorder. So depersonalization means a feeling of being detached or estranged from yourself. People often describe it as if they're in a dream watching over themselves, and they lose control over their thoughts or actions like they're outside their body. That's depersonalization. Derealization is detachment from the surrounding world. Patients feel like they're not in the world anymore. Objects can seem foggy or visually distorted. So if you understand that, then it's easy to understand depersonalization derealization disorder. This is often triggered by trauma, just like all dissociative disorders. And these patients develop significant distress and impairment because of symptoms of depersonalization or derealization. Importantly, they will have intact reality testing, and this is different from psychosis. So in a patient with DDD, they are aware that the sensations they're having of being out of their body or floating above the world are not real. In contrast, a patient with psychosis will actually say to you, I am floating outside of my body, and they believe it to be true. And the treatment for depersonalization derealization disorder is psychotherapy. We'll finish this video by talking about dissociative identity disorder, also known as multiple personality disorder. And if you want to understand this disorder, make sure you go and watch the movie Fight Club, although I've just violated the first rule of Fight Club by telling you to do that. Dissociative identity disorder is more common in women, and it's associated with severe childhood trauma or abuse, especially patients who have had sexual abuse before the age of 6, Many of these patients go on to develop DID. This disorder gets its name because patients with dissociative identity disorder have two or more distinct identities. They're known as personality states, and each state has its own collection of behavior and memories and thinking patterns. Sometimes others will observe the patient going from one state to another. Other times the patient will report that they go back and forth between two different states. These patients often have gaps in memory about events that occurred when they were in an alternate personality state, and the symptoms have to cause distress or problems in functioning in order to meet criteria. And the treatment is with psychotherapy. Dissociative identity disorder often occurs together with other disorders, especially PTSD, depression, and substance abuse. It can also co-occur with certain personality disorders, in particular avoidant personality disorder and borderline personality disorder. And then lastly, patients with dissociative identity disorder often have a number of somatoform conditions. These are somatic disorders that I talk about in another video, and basically they involve physical symptoms that cannot be explained by an underlying organic medical condition. And that concludes our module on dissociative disorders.